The question that arises for me from that is, why are we surprised? It seems to me that this is how regimes behave. It's part of their DNA to stop what they might consider critical or harmful to them and to punish the offenders. Over the last decades, China has gained significantly increased geopolitical and economic power, and as again may be expected, is taking a similar approach with other countries, where criticism of China is met with threats to cut off or limit economic relationships. Again, this should be no cause for surprise. When China was admitted to the WTO, the West, maybe in our arrogance, made two big misjudgments. The first is that China would play by international trading rules, and it can be reasonably argued, I think, that China couldn't abide by such rules. It had no hand in setting those rules, and they're really not compatible with China's own system of political economy, where the boundary between private enterprise and state control is, let's just call it, fuzzy. The second assumption we made, because we think our system is the best, is that economic prosperity would automatically lead to democratization. But we know that with the installation of President Xi as leader for life, that is not going to happen anytime soon. And in fact, increased prosperity is seen as evidence of the success of the current system. The West and the UK, maybe now we face an unenviable choice. Do we see China primarily as a market, continue to build further economic relations? And if we do that, will we increasingly be subjecting ourselves to coercion, with progressive dilution of our ability to stand up for what we believe? In other words, should we follow the money, be venal and not worry about our democracies and the West's sphere of influence, or should it be the other way around? So I like to leave you with two recent events. The first is a quote which says, "Throw away your illusions and prepare for a fight." That might have come from Donald Trump. It didn't. It was a recent headline in an editorial in a newspaper run by the China's People Liberation Army, a headline borrowed from a very similar statement by Mao Zedong in 1949. The second gets us back to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we all want to learn from everybody's experience, and Taiwan has had particular successful experience in managing their epidemic. But China has blocked Taiwan's attendance at WHO meetings until the island accepts that it is part of China and subject to its regime. So what should we do now that the UK is floating free without the diplomatic heft of being part of a major trading bloc that is the EU? What should our approach to China be? Who will be our allies? Is a cohesive Western alliance even possible? Our first speaker today is, we're fortunate to have Isabel Hilton, who has a lot of experience in China. She's a journalist and also the CEO of China Dialogue. And seeing as she knows China a lot better than certainly me, I won't speak for anybody else, maybe she can give us a perspective with those kinds of spectacles of greater knowledge about China. So Isabel, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. So it's a rather heavy load you've just put on my shoulders. I think when we look at China, and I think British policy towards China has lurched around for, the last couple of decades, from, engagement to unbridled enthusiasm to suspicion, and now we seem to be moving into greater suspicion. So I just want to kind of pause and look at the moment in China, and as an exercise in imagination, to imagine that we've woken up this morning and we're running China, and what do we see? And I think that if you look back on the last 30 years, you think, yes, it all went pretty well. We survived the USSR's collapse, you know, growth. We've had relative social peace. We've done with the second largest economy and all that. If you look forward, it looks much less convincing. And I think that we sometimes underestimate the accumulation of problems that China is having to deal with. And if you're running China, you start with your problems at home, and the outside world, you know, is you know, it's a second order issue. It's a very important issue, but it's a second order issue. And these two views also connect with each other. So if you are worried, as you would be if you were running China today, about towering levels of debt, about an aging population, about a slowing economy, when actually a growing economy has been what you have bought your social peace with. And now the hostility of the United States and the impacts of the pandemic, you really have quite a lot on your plate. It is not at all obvious that China is going to recover from this quickly or easily, not least because China's markets are badly hit as well. So there will be a long tail of this pandemic. It's suffered a reputational blow. It has a real problem with what is going to supply its growth at home at this point. So those are worries. And then I would add to that, if the economy does slow and the party is no longer delivering on this ever rising prosperity, making China great again kind of narrative, then you have to worry about what story you are telling your people about the current situation. And hence the wartime, the metaphors, the fierce struggle, the nationalism, and the notion that China's done really well, but the wicked foreigner is always trying to undermine China. And we've seen a resurgence of that kind of language and sentiment very strongly in China at the moment. Now, the difficulty with that position, and part of it is in response to the United States, but not all of it. But the difficulty with that position is that you have to carry that forward into your relations with the outside world. And that has created further tensions, not just with the United States, but with the European Union, with France, with Sweden, with Canada, with Australia, with many, many other countries, where China's more aggressive stance has set up, again, the kind of reaction that China really doesn't need. It's not helpful to China to have a suspicious and unfriendly world. So China's public diplomacy has gone very, very badly wrong, I think, certainly in the last few weeks, but actually over a longer period. I would say in the last year or two, it's been over assertive, and it's creating further problems for China. Now, what should the UK do about it? And what does China see when it looks at the UK? Frankly, I think when China looks at the UK, it sees, you know, a country which is of less interest than it was than when it was in the European Union, a country that has its own problems and that is in very urgent need of some kind of success, a trade deal, something that is going to deliver the future that's been promised. And that puts China in a very strong position vis-a-vis the United Kingdom in terms of any future negotiations. What China wants from the UK, not that much that it can't get elsewhere, but some important things. For example, the practice, if you like, of learning about nuclear regulation in an advanced economy. That would act as a kite mark for selling nuclear installations elsewhere. It would also be of some political use to China if it were able to detach the United Kingdom from the US position at this point. That would score very well at home. A sense that China could score some victory over a former imperial power would also play very well at home. So China, you know, is actually in a rather stronger position, I believe, vis-a-vis the UK than the UK is vis-a-vis China right now. So there might be some political use for China in its relationship with the United Kingdom, but I don't think there's a great deal to hope for the United Kingdom vis-a-vis China. can't hear you. I think you're muted, Joe.
I'm muted. Thank you, Isabel. That was great, nice and concise, but highly informative and very useful. Thank you so much appreciated. I'd now like to move on to Charlie Duquesne. Charlie is a businessman and a 15-year veteran of doing business in China, mostly on the mainland, but also recently in Hong Kong. And he has held several business development and general management roles, largely in the shipping industry. So he now has no longer any business interests in China, as I understand it, but obviously comes with a lot of experience on how, on the practicalities, the everyday practicalities of doing business in China. So Charlie, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Actually, just to declare, I have one small angel investment that still has a substantial presence in China, but I am a passive investor in that. So other than that, I have absolutely no business left in China at all. I think I'd like to start off by saying that I lived in mainland China for 14 of the last 18 years in Beijing, Chengdu, Shanghai, and various other places, and I've seen China beginning to take steps in the wrong direction. I am a big critic of what's happened since Xi Jinping has taken over, and I think there's a lot of things that I find very, very uncomfortable. I also did my master's thesis on the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, and it's in an area I've traveled around quite widely, and it makes me very angry and upset to see the horrendous things going on there. I want to preface that because I'm about to change tack. In the context of that, I'm very worried that Britain is about to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about the economy. I'm going to talk about Hong Kong, where I lived until January this year, and I'm going to talk about engagement and understanding. Starting on the economy, whilst China is slowing down quite fast, in the last 10 years, the China-UK relationship, economic relationship, has been speeding up. And there's a bit of a misunderstanding about the golden age, the George Osborne, David Cameron thing. They came second. China's position in the business cycle meant that it was buying more services, more branded goods, and more high tech. We were just moving, it was moving into the place where we could sell a lot of goods to them, and it was speeding up. In the future, in the AI space and in the new economy that's developing, frankly, we are one of three superpowers when it comes to producing the high-end gizmology that exists around that. And our biggest competitor is America, and our second largest competitor is Israel. And that's why I'm very concerned when I see in the media in the UK today, this growing, we need to become a proxy in Trump's trade war with China, because it looks to me like we could be being conned by the Americans into doing something that will hurt us and possibly help them. As you all know, Germany in the last 30 years is the only country that's a developed country that's consistently run a trade surplus with China. If you look at why that was, and you then extrapolate that onto the UK today, there's no reason why that the increasing two-way trade cannot keep on speeding up. We just need to bear that in mind. Of course, we have to be sensible about what we're trading in. We have to be sensible about who China is. They are a communist dictatorship. However, I disagree with some of your opening remarks, actually, Joe, where I think it's a much more complicated thing than this monolith that is in the sort of Daily Mail imagination. I'd like to then move on to Hong Kong, really, because I think Hong Kong distorts a lot of what we view as being of how we view China. Just to make it personal, I got tear gassed twice in the last year. My office is right next to the government offices. I watched that going on firsthand. yes, there's an element of that whole debate, that whole protest movement that is about the encroaching power of China in Hong Kong, but it is a much more complicated story than that. And you have to understand that it is just as much about a very, very light touch regulation, very low tax economy, where it's one of the richest societies on earth, but on the Gini coefficient, it sits between Gabon and Ghana. And that is as important, if not more, than this sort of feeling that China is slowly squeezing Hong Kong of its traditional liberties. Secondly, there's a much more complicated thing, but very, very real. There's a culture war going on between the Cantonese and Mandarin cultures, which is not about the Chinese mainland authorities. It's about one Chinese culture that has 1.3 billion people in it, and one that has 7 million in Hong Kong and 70 million in Guangdong, and the slow erosion of that culture. The third point I'd like to make is that if we disengage with China, what happens when the next pandemic comes along? We say we've had a bad time of it now. Actually, if you go beyond, and again, I slightly disagreed with the way Joe introduced this. If you go beyond the headlines, there has been a degree of engagement with the Chinese on sorting this out. What happens if we're not engaged? And so what I'd like to really call for is for any legislature on this call today, make sure you understand what you're engaging with before you come to strong conclusions or argue for particular points of view, because this could really damage the UK and really damage the world if we get this wrong. So we need to keep engaging, and we need to keep understanding. We need to develop our understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. That was a very interesting perspective from somebody who knows things on the ground much better than I do. Very useful input. Thank you so much. I'd like to move over to Tom Tugenhadt. Tom is the chair, he's the MP for Tonbridge and Malling, and he's the chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and also the chair of the Parliamentary China Research Group, besides kindly being an ambassador for Politica, which is our youth wing. So if you like, Tom is in the eye of the storm, chairing the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and we're all looking forward to how the world looks, how China looks from your position.
Thank you, Joe. Can I start off by thanking Isabel and Charlie? I thought your perspectives were hugely interesting and very insightful. Maybe I can start off by saying we're dealing really with a very different China to the one that I think that George Osborne and David Cameron were looking at. And I don't think it would be fair to look at criticizing their golden era speeches because the world has actually changed. The expectations of 2010 of peaceful coexistence leading to greater integration, or the other way around actually, have not paid off in the way that we expected. And some of the evidence for this is seen in a paper published on Medium recently by James Kanagasuriam, who showed how what we're seeing is something that we hadn't expected. Up until a decade or so ago, we saw that increased wealth led to increased democratization. Well, that isn't so anymore. And the reason that isn't so is because China is very actively seeking to change the influence networks, the allegiance networks that bind us together. Now, this puts a real strain on the UK because, as Charlie quite rightly puts it, we are one of the centers of technical expertise. Some of that technical expertise, of course, is summed up in the various different startup industries that we see around the UK, whether in pure tech or biotech or any number of other things. But some of that technical expertise is also in the simple fact that due to an accident of history and our subsequent investment in it, we are here in the UK the underpinning architecture of the international rules-based system. The accountancy, the maritime law, the trade law that underpins that globalization that has seen the world prosper in peace, largely, for the best part of 70 years, is underwritten by, in many ways, systems built up here in these islands and then exported. That's why we've managed to increase our economy through the value chain to really the highest end and to be at the service end of the economy. But that's also why China's undermining of that order by challenging it directly in some parts and incrementally in others is such a particular threat to the UK economy. And that's why the UK has a particular responsibility to respond and to respond in partnership with others. Now, I think this is where the pressure on the UK is particularly great, and I think this is where it won't surprise you to hear, but I'm not always aligned with all my Conservative colleagues on this. But I think this is one of those areas where the Conservative Party and other parties in Parliament have to really look hard at what is possible in the UK and what is therefore our most wise course of action. The first question is what is possible in the UK? Look, we had a vote in 2016 and we had another one in December, and the decision on any European Union membership is now clear. The real decision now is what do we do in order to defend the international rules-based system? What do we do to defend our own economic interests around the world? And I think this is where the UK can, if we choose to be bold, if we actually choose to have a foreign office for the first time in a number of years, that actually has a strategy and actually has a policy, then maybe we could actually do something. And what we should be looking at doing is building up partnerships with countries around the world, from Japan all the way to Chile, or rather the other, that's if you go over the land route. If you go over the sea route, of course, there's not many countries there. What we need to be doing is thinking about building up partnerships with countries that also depend on the international rules-based system. Now, currently that's a lot. That's countries from South America and Indonesia through to Nigeria and indeed many others in South America. But incrementally, as China is seeking to extend its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, we're seeing those countries and that number eroded. So this is really coming to a turning point. Now, we know we have a difficult partnership in the United States, and we know that we have some particular challenges with some of our European partners as well. We have some very good allies in others, but we have some challenges with some. So this is a moment when the UK really does have to decide that it wants to have a serious foreign policy, not because we're expansionist, but because actually this foreign policy underwrites the United Kingdom's domestic economy. And our choice is not whether or not we have a foreign policy, our choice is whether or not we have a domestic policy, which we are reflecting through our foreign actions. So I think that's those are the points that I would like to make. And this is not to say that China should be, and Charlie's point about babies and bathwater is absolutely right. Those of us who have children may be tempted to throw out the baby with the bathwater, particularly after several weeks of lockdown. But the reality is there is a huge amount that we should all be able to do together. China is a hugely important part of our international system. China's role in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when the international rules were being set, as Isabel rightly said, was not as widespread as it should have been. And indeed, Britain has played an important part in trying to begin redressing this by joining things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we should be doing more like that. But there is an awful lot that we must do together. Now, we have a slight advantage with President Xi, or rather, to give him his senior title, General Secretary Xi, because of course he's only president of China by being General Secretary of the Communist Party. It's not the other way around. So his senior title is General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. What the General Secretary has done is he has moved early, and he has shown his teeth early. And for the whole series of internal pressure reasons that Isabel mentioned, we have seen China act in many ways before it was actually ready. And so actually the West does have a moment to respond. If General Secretary Xi had waited a few years, it's doubtful we would have been. So this is a real wake-up call. COVID is part of that, but not the essential part of that. And it's really important that we take this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Excellent as expected. Some interesting points that you raised that we'll probably come back to in the discussion, if we may. I'd now like to move on to Lord Wallace. Lord Wallace is a Liberal Democrat peer, former Director of Studies at Chatham House, and was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office spokesperson in the Lords during the coalition government. Thank you, William, for joining us.
Just by way of introduction, I would say I once wrote a book with Tom's uncle on the future of British foreign policy some time ago. And my most direct involvement in British-China relations was when I was at the London School of Economics, and we were being approached at the beginning of our what is now a very extensive relationship with China. And I'll just flag up that one of the areas which is very sensitive to our future relations with China is education and research. The Chinese overtook the Americans as the largest foreign contingent in the London School of Economics some time ago now. Our universities and our private school system are almost dependent on China in terms of the revenue stream. There was a certain amount of shared research, and so far we haven't got into the same position as the United States in terms of wondering about Chinese researchers in this country and what they're looking into, but that is a difficult area. And we are just approaching the area where Chinese foreign investment into this country, which was welcomed, is now being looked at a great deal more suspiciously. So those are three areas where British policy is beginning to change. In the education sector, of course, we had the tremendous problems with Confucius Institutes and what Confucius Institutes should do. I'm glad I'm no longer teaching international relations at the LSE, because I used to have Japanese and other students coming up to protest at me at how I was describing their own country's foreign policy. And I can imagine what Chinese students would now be doing if I was still giving that course. We have to remember that China was key to the idea of global Britain as it was spelled out. We were leaving the declining European market behind, and we were going to put much more effort into exporting and relating to the growing Pacific market. China and the countries around it were absolutely the key to that. That was part of the vision. And where we are now is that we're beginning to discover that that's not so easy, and it raises all sorts of political, humanitarian, and other problems in its wake. We also had the problem that part of global Britain for people like Boris Johnson was that we were going to extend British power across the globe. And Boris Johnson, when Foreign Secretary, spoke on at least 2 or 3 occasions of sending an aircraft carrier task force into the South China Sea. Not terribly easy if you're pursuing good relations with China at the same time, but necessary if you see yourself as the closest ally of the United States. It seems to me that we have now to work as closely as Tom has said with those whom we think share our concerns and will want to present a common front. What's happening in Australia at the present moment is very interesting, and since our Conservative government does look to Australia and New Zealand and Singapore as some of our closest partners as we develop our Pacific strategy, that is something which we need to develop it as closely as we can. We have, I think, to keep open as many lines to China as we can, and that means not cutting off the flow of students to this country while managing the increasing pressure which those who are still teaching, as I've now retired, will find about not criticizing what's happening inside China, not criticizing Chinese foreign policy, that some schools and universities are beginning to get. That's not going to be easy because, as Isabel tactfully said, the Chinese see us as weaker now that we've left the EU, and as needing them a great deal more than they need us. So we have to work very closely with those that we can find, including the French and the Germans and the structures of the EU on foreign policy, insofar as they can work out a strategy on China, and many of them are finding it as difficult as we are. Thanks.
Thank you very much, William. That's great. Lots of things that I'll come back to you on, if I may, during the discussion. And our final speaker is Stephen Kinnock, who is the Labour Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific, and working through Labour's position on China policy. Stephen is kindly also one of our board members, and we're looking forward to hearing how he's navigating this minefield.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you also to all the excellent speakers we've just had. I agree with a tremendous amount of what's already been said, and I think one of the messages that emerges from what everybody is saying is that managing the rise of China is the #1 global geopolitical challenge that the world is facing. And I think we all can agree on that point. What I think we can also agree on is that there isn't a single global challenge that can't be addressed and tackled without constructive engagement with China, from climate change to the fight against organized crime, to dealing with this post-pandemic recovery, to having free and fair trade, to having a proper dialogue on nuclear non-proliferation. All roads lead to China. So we need constructive engagement in China. I don't think there's any disagreement over that. I think the possible lines of disagreement may come on how to achieve that more constructive engagement. And I'll say a bit about that in a second. I think it's always worth, when you're developing a new strategy, to review where you've got to date. And there's obviously 3 main dimensions to our relationship with China: economic, political, and security related. And I think when you look at where we are now and how the relationship has developed, let's say over the last 10 years, I think there's no doubt at all that it's been an abject failure in terms of the bilateral relationship. Just look at the economics. The so-called golden era with China was supposed to be an age of bounty for us in terms of opening up the Chinese market. And yet we're still running a £22 billion trade deficit with China. Our exports, I think it accounts for about 5% of our exports compared to 49% of what we send to the European Union. So it really feels like it's been one-way traffic on the economy. And we've also seen heavily state-subsidized industry. For example, the steel industry, an issue very close to my heart because I have the largest steelworks in the country in my constituency. The state, the Chinese steel industry is subsidized to the tune of about 80% of its ownership is state-owned. They have been engaged in a massive overproduction of steel, creating a glut on the market, which has pushed prices down, which in turn has created a crisis in the Western European steel industry. That is potentially tremendously damaging to communities such as the one that I represent. So on the economy, it just feels, I think we rolled the red carpet out for China, but got very, very little in return. On politics and political influence, can we really point to much evidence that we have been able to exert influence on China? If you look at the increasingly hard line they take on human rights issues, from the Uyghurs to what's been happening in Hong Kong, to the position on Taiwan, there's very little influence in evidence of any kind of success in terms of exerting and projecting our influence. And I think that's very much connected also to the economic piece, which is we haven't had enough strategic independence to be able to reduce the leverage that China has. And I think what you see is, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative, it's often used as a tool to intimidate politically by simply saying, well, we will discontinue economic relations with you unless you toe the line politically. And that's something we've seen in many different cases in many different countries. And it's also been very effective in terms of the EU. If you look at the China's 17+1 strategy of getting closer and closer to Central and Eastern European countries, and we've seen how that's played out in the post-pandemic context, you know, with people like the president of Serbia saying, well, we are full of thanks to the People's Republic of China, and as far as the European Union is concerned, thanks for nothing. So there's been a very successful, I think, building of alliances and exploiting divisions within Europe. And I think that we need to see that in a broad, long-term political context, which is China has increasingly, I think, become a systemic rival in terms of having its kind of model of responsive authoritarian government becoming, I think, something that it sees as a viable alternative to democracy. And that is a message that's consistently being pumped out, particularly after the way in which we've seen, frankly, quite messy responses to managing the coronavirus issue. China is putting itself forward as, look, our model of governance is the one that the world should be adopting. So I think we need to be very conscious of a move from transactional relationships into a systemic rivalry. And finally, on security, I think there is something we need, you know, we should learn from history. And history shows us that when a rising power challenges the status quo, it can often lead to military confrontation. And that's something that if we don't learn the lessons of history, we're condemned to repeat it. So I think we need to be very conscious about the risks there. And that's why I think there's obviously a consensus about we need a constructive engagement with China. We need to be less naive, much more realistic about the risks that we face, and then how to get that genuine reset that we want. And my view is we need a kind of respect-based realism. We are full of respect for Chinese culture, history, the amazing achievements. What they've done in the last 30 years is absolutely remarkable, what they've achieved, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and it's been an incredible journey that they've been on. We respect that, but we are also realistic about the strategy and the agenda. And the way to get a respect-based relationship is to push back, is to be robust. So I think we need to be robust on a range of issues. We need to get to the truth of what happened in terms of the origins of this epidemic, and what happened in December and January, primarily because this is not about, you know, scoring points or getting revenge. It's actually about a desperate need for us to learn the lessons and make sure that this never happens again. I think we need as well to get much smarter on takeovers, and we need to beef up our takeover rules and regulations so that we integrate national security concerns much more directly into decisions about takeovers. And then I think there's a huge agenda that we can engage with China on in terms of climate change and how we connect that to rebuilding a reputation for China, because I think they are genuinely concerned about their reputation in terms of what's happened because of the pandemic. So that would be my take on this is, if we want to have effective diplomatic engagement, that engagement has to be based on mutual respect. The way to have mutual respect is to have a robust engagement where you are prepared to push back politically, to make sure that we defend our values, to not be intimidated by threats of economic retaliation, because frankly, that is not the way to run a foreign policy or a strategy for engagement with China. And I think also really moving from into a kind of plurilateral engagement where we identify partners in the region, you know, South Korea, Japan. Certainly don't agree with everything that Mr. Modi is doing in India, but I think there's an opportunity to build a long-term strategic relationship with India so that we've strengthened our alliances in the region, because I think that's going to be very important going forward. So we need that genuine reset, and I think there's a way to do it which is not about being unduly hostile or provocative in any way, shape or form, because that's counterproductive, but it is about being robust, and it is about being realistic about what's really going on there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Great. A very balanced perspective. One of the issues that we often have in these meetings, webinars, whatever you want to call them, is that everybody ends up agreeing with each other, which is very frustrating. So I'd like to introduce something for, you know, to generate a little bit of disagreement, maybe. I'd like to start with Isabel, who mentioned the internal issues with China that they have to focus on. When I was last in China, a young lady said to me, we don't really care what type of regime we have. We've always had regimes in our countries. In our country, there have been emperors. You know, we've always had essentially authoritarian regime. As long as the people are happy, that's fine. But if the people are not happy, then we all know that the people are stronger than the regime. To what extent do you think that the Chinese regime is, you know, uncomfortable at the moment about its own security?
I think the signs are that it's certainly nervous. You know, if the regime were feeling secure, the censorship would not be as it is. The wave of criticism that emerged in mid-January to early February of the handling of the first stage of the pandemic was absolutely ferocious, and included a number of very, very prominent people, you know, very prominent business people, public intellectuals and so on. They've all vanished from the scene. We don't know where they are, or you know what's happening to them. So clearly the regime is nervous, and the kind of margin for tolerance of dissenting views has become much, much narrower than it was, you know, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you had a regime which currently it's fashionable to think of as ineffective, but it was certainly much broader based, and it encouraged, you know, civil society. It was, you know, building some kind of legal apparatus. It was allowing people to challenge, you know, big companies, and you know there were very, very encouraging signs about the sort of mechanisms of how Chinese society was evolving, and all that has gone into reverse. And I don't think it's gone into reverse because it's easier to be repressive. I think it's gone into reverse because the regime is nervous. Now, it's true that, you know, there isn't a massive democratic tradition in China, to put it mildly. However, you know, this is still it's a country which, since the fall of the empire more than 100 years ago now, has seen repeated public arguments about who owns this place. Is it the emperor or is it the people? And how does that get expressed in politics? I don't think we need to kind of plant our own ideas of democracy onto China to see that there is a big and ongoing political conversation that goes on within China about, you know, how power should be held and exercised, whether the party should ever be above the law, what's the role of dissent. And it has emerged repeatedly in very large and obvious manifestations of challenge to the party, you know, from 1979 Democracy Wall, or 1987, you know, with the death of Hu Yaobang, or 1989 Tiananmen. You know, these things recur, and they wouldn't recur if everybody was content with an authoritarian system. And part of the, you know, what we now think of as the illusions of you know, the period from the 1990s to 2008-ish, that China would democratize, were really about looking at the kind of liberal trends within China, which seemed to be gaining ground, and what they were demanding. And I remember being at a meeting just before Xi Jinping came to power, and a series of Chinese businessmen largely being asked what they hoped for from the incoming regime, and they all said political reform. And that was a time when all manner of transitions were being studied, when, you know, what sort of shape or what sort of internal party democracy there should be was being discussed. So we've lost a lot, actually, since Xi Jinping came to power. We've lost the idea that the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, which was that there should be term limits in order to avoid the personalization of power, or that there should be collective responsibility, again, to avoid the personalization of power. And that, I think, won't go away as you know, a memory in the Chinese political system. It's not the moment right now. But nor do I think that the level of control and repression that we see at the moment will be easily maintained, particularly if the economy does suffer the difficulties that it is expected to suffer, partly as a result of the virus, but also as a result of just being in the middle income moment, you know, and trying to avoid the middle income trap. So that whilst the West is sort of waking up or presenting this idea of China as an unstoppable beer mouse, I think inside China, it's looking quite a lot, you know, it's looking rather more iffy than that.
Excellent, thank you. Charlie, you wanted to express some disagreement with what Stephen said.
Oh, yes, somewhat. I just like one sentence on what Isabel just said, just to really back that up, actually, is that I was in Beijing during the handover between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, and I remember how close it got to civil chaos with the murder of, what was his name, the English guy, Neil Hayward, and all of that going on. And this current regime is founded in weakness. What we see as this sort of aggressive stance, to me, is the stance of somebody who is afraid, and I can see he's afraid of multiple things. And to me, rather than seeing them as an aggressor, my personal biggest fear about China is that it collapses inwards. And I can go on for hours about that, but I won't. Just on, I don't entirely accept what Stephen was saying about the economic relationship, and trade statistics, look, I'm in shipping, I move things around the world for a living. Trade statistics are nonsense, basically. And a simple way of explaining that is how many Boeing aircraft has Boeing sold to the Chinese in the last 15 years, and pretty much everything at the top end of technology in those is British, and it's recorded as exports to America. So it's just simply incorrect to say that we haven't been selling more things directly or indirectly to China. We have. On the steel mill thing, I think that's down to again, I move a lot of steel around the world, so yes, you're right, there has been this issue with state subsidy to the Chinese. There's a great inefficiency, but having visited many Chinese steel mill towns, I just wonder why we focus on trying to keep that kind of industry and don't just keep on trying to push ourselves up the value chain. But maybe that's
that's not as easy. That's not as easily said as done as said.
Of course, but it's also if we start protecting industries, I mean, yeah, then that maybe is a different discussion. On one of the things I'd really like to come back on, actually, is around the students that Lord Wallace was talking about, and just say we've got two big problems here, and this should really, I hope, guide the legislators on the call. We have 1,200 people graduating in Chinese in this country. If we were at parity, pro rata with America, we'd have about 38,000. We have institutionalized ignorance about China, and I'm using a very strong term. We need to have a much clearer strategy about how we engage, starting with education, starting with, I've heard people talking about how describing China as this monolith, which it clearly isn't. Your opening remark, Joe, was actually just incorrect. You were talking about the local government covering up what went on in Wuhan. Once the state government got it, actually things began to change. And you can just go and look at both the Chinese language and the English language non-political literature about this. And we need to understand that those two forces, along with a lot of other forces, are quite often at loggerheads. Somebody in the chat has mentioned Bo Xilai. He used Chongqing as a power base, nearly overthrew Xi Jinping before he got back in. But I do think that we need to really, really focus on educating ourselves about this and educating our country about it. And just to finish on one thing, I've reached out to a few friends, and there was a Cabinet Office poll done going out across the country about what people thought about China. And they were surprised by the result. It wasn't we see them as the red under the bed. It wasn't that we see them as this great economic opportunity. They just didn't see them. And that was the conclusion. There was just a complete blank, or an overwhelmingly, that China was seen as this unknown, we don't know, we don't care. And we need to start from a very basic place to sort of start rectifying that if we're going to deal with these problems properly.
Thank you. I'd like to turn back to Tom, if I may. Everybody talks about a constructive relationship with China. And nobody, certainly I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what that could look like, and also the extent to which there is this tension. After all, we are nowhere near the size economy of China, nowhere near the size military of China. So how do we resolve this tension of a constructive relationship without becoming subordinate as a much smaller economy, much smaller country?
Well, this is where partnership matters. And, we're not starting from the place I advocated we would have started in 3 years ago, but the decisions have been taken. And there are, the idea that reverting to the European Union alone is the answer is simply false. The European Union doesn't have one foreign policy, and even its trade policy is actually much more mixed than the single market would lead you to believe. Germany's trade policy in China is very different from, say, France's trade policy in China, as is evidenced by the different engagements by the chambers of commerce or the major industries. So actually, what we're talking about here, what the UK is talking about now, shouldn't be hugely controversial to any country that depends on an international trading system. And I cited a few last time, but now I could cite some more. Countries like Greece or Nigeria that in different ways also rely on international trade. These countries, working together, can create a guardian for the system that is keeping them all prosperous and safe. I mean, the alternative to it, by the way, is very simple. If you don't operate the rule of law, you operate the rule of force. And what China, and to a certain extent, the bilateralism coming out of the Trump White House is trying to do is to change from that rule of law into some form of a leverage system. Force may be overstating it, but some form of a leverage system. So looking for ways in which we can cooperate with China is important, but it means recognizing that other countries have to obey the rules too. Otherwise, it's not the rule of law. It's one side obeying the rule of law and the other one cheating, bluntly. And that's largely what we've seen for the last 20 years since China joined the WTO. I mean, it's laughable that China is still a developing nation according to the WTO. It's completely absurd. And yet, there it is. And in many ways, what we're asking the UK government to do, and many of you will know I have been critical of the UK government in the past on foreign policy, and I am here as well. What we're asking the UK government to do is to recognize that there is simply no point in pretending that there is an agreement if one side is regularly flouting it. And that's what we're seeing. And so what we need to do is to find ways to either make the agreement work or to find ways of working with others to enforce it better. Now, there are countries like, as I say, like Japan, like India, Australia, Canada, France, that are standing up for these things. And France's rejection of Huawei didn't come about in the last year. It came about in 2009 because they saw the threat that Stephen has spoken about, steel dumping, but actually a far bigger threat to the UK is tech dumping that we're seeing, where Huawei is not really a Chinese company. Huawei is a Canadian company called Nortel that was bought, increased, and is now being hugely subsidized by state aid to achieve market dominant positions around the world. That's not Chinese innovation, that's Canadian innovation with Chinese money. And so we're seeing a very different kind of world being built, which is leading to a monopolistic supply chain, which I think increases hugely the vulnerability of the world economy.
Thank you, Tom. You talked about working with others, and I'd like to bring William back in. Given where the world is today, what do you see as the likelihood over the coming 5 years of really being able to reconstruct some kind of Western alliance showing a united front?
I have a delicious memory many years ago of spending an evening in Beijing with the ambassadors of Ireland, Austria, Sweden, and I can't remember which other small European countries, asking them why they found it so necessary to have large embassies in Beijing when really they shared the interests of their neighbors. And they were all doing their best to insist that their interests were different and they had to have a different policy. Tom is quite right. There isn't a coherent European policy, but then actually, I find it very hard to think of any Western country that knows quite how to treat China at the present moment. We're all in confusion over it. I agree strongly that we need to educate more people about it. London School of Economics, incidentally, does have 1 or 2 joint degrees with the Chinese, and a very high proportion of people apply to do that. But it's still far too small for what we need. But that's part of our general problem of young people who don't learn about foreign countries or foreign languages. If we are going to engage with this, we have got to work with others, and that means working on the sort of second tier level, or working with think tanks and universities as well as directly with governments, chairs of foreign affairs committees, no doubt as well, to try and work out how we handle this and how we protect ourselves from being picked off one by one, as we so often are, by demonstrating to the Chinese that we are working together.
Thank you. Just like to pick up on some of the comments in the chat here. I've had a couple of comments from Ismail Erturk, who's a reader in banking at the University of Manchester Business School, who makes a couple of comments about he runs banking programs in the UK for Chinese banks. And while they adopt a market-oriented discourse, they do something different, but agrees that we have to learn more about China. He also makes another comment, which is when we have big businesses, both in Europe and in the US, whose stock market valuation essentially depends on the Chinese market. To what extent does that in itself exercise a certain degree of, or force a certain degree of restraint in terms of how we treat, how we deal with China? Stephen, comments?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I absolutely agree with the comments about the need to improve our understanding of Chinese culture and history and politics and society. I actually worked for about 11 years for the British Council and had postings in different countries, Brussels and Africa, but I had 3 years in Russia. And the thing I learned more than anything else from my time in Russia is the real profound lack of understanding between countries and between cultures. And the work that the British Council does, I think, is absolutely outstanding in terms of helping other countries to understand what Britain is and what 21st century UK looks like. What we need to do more of is promote understanding of other countries in this country. I'm extremely worried about the numbers of young people learning foreign languages in general is falling off a cliff. And we certainly don't have enough young people learning Mandarin. So I think that is an absolute must. And, you know, that, I suppose that plays to what I was pushing for, advocating in my opening remarks, is this idea of respect-based realism. It's about having mutual respect for each other. And we have to be absolutely clear that we have profound respect for Chinese culture, history, politics, traditions. It is a remarkable civilization.
But is it mutual?
We have to, then I think there's a big question about whether it's mutual. And I am forced to draw the conclusion that as things stand, it isn't. And I've had a conversation in recent days with somebody that you might describe as a wolf warrior diplomat. And I would say there was very, very little respect in that conversation. And there is a tone of real aggression coming forward. I think people are right that it's a tone of aggression that is coming more from a point of weakness than strength, because I think there's genuine concerns about what the impact of unleashing this coronavirus on the world may be for China going forward. But I think it's also an element, maybe a hangover of, because we haven't been robust in our engagement, because people have been too easily intimidated, there's a kind of, it's almost a dynamic that's built into the relationship, and that needs to change, you know. And being diplomatic means being robust at times, and I think we have to be absolutely clear on that. And I think, I personally feel that we should, we can have a debate about trade figures and the deficit and all the rest of it, but I just think that to a large extent we've been played. We've been played by a narrative that there was going to be an alignment with the international rules-based order. There was going to be a slow but steady aligning with democratic norms. That clearly has not happened. It's certain, and the relationship has been too one way. So, you know, I think it's a lot of this is about helping with the rhetoric, helping with the understanding, showing that we're investing in increasing international understanding of China, but also showing that we are ready to stand up for our values and for our interests, and that is not up for negotiation.
Thank you. Ans Kolk, who is a professor of business here in Amsterdam, has reacted to Charlie's comments that the UK has a significant advantage in emerging technologies like AI. Some have taken the view that if we do have an advantage, it is pretty transient, because the Chinese are going to be able to accumulate a lot more data. Tom, do you believe that our advantages, our comparative advantages, whatever they may be, AI or others, are sustainable enough, that they give us enough diplomatic strength?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, I think there's a huge confusion between firepower and innovation. The Chinese have got enormous firepower, and they can throw massive weight of numbers of engineers, developers, whatever, at a problem. And certainly that does give them an advantage. And it's absolutely true that the digital exhaust that they produce on a daily basis is, I mean, the privacy settings that frankly would make a British lawyer blush, give them an advantage. But it's not necessarily a world-leading advantage. I mean, there is a reason why China is spending an awful lot of money buying up or trying to buy up UK, French, German, American, Canadian, and so on firms. There's a reason why the Chinese ambassador in Israel was not always very popular in the boardrooms of Tel Aviv, even before he died, sadly, about 48 hours ago. China is seeking to buy up what it can't do itself, and what it can't do itself at the moment, this may change, is innovate, which is why I think Isabel's absolutely right. You know, the Chinese Communist Party is looking quite seriously at the challenges that it faces. And the challenges that it faces are lack of innovation, a very, very volatile population. I mean, what is not being reported in much of the Western media, but you can see it on Weibo and you can see it on various elements of the web, is very large-scale civil unrest in very contained areas, almost constantly all over China, which is leading to, you know, the crackdowns. The reason there are 1 million Uyghurs in prison is not because General Secretary Xi feels that you know, he wishes to house over 1 million Uyghurs, but because he is genuinely threatened by unrest brought about in the West. The reason he's cracking down on Hong Kong is not because he's trying to kill the golden goose, but because he's afraid of the precedent that it sets for other areas. So I think that China's communist leaders, rather, are incredibly aware that the system that they have put in place is not innovating, is not keeping up with many of the tech developments, even if they are then able to buy and develop them more deeply. And what they're actually doing is they are injecting huge vulnerability. You know, the reality is, unless the state grows, you can argue the percentage rate, but unless the state keeps growing, then the deal that the population have struck with the government is one that is particularly vulnerable. Sorry, that's the division bell. So
Okay.
the deal is one that no longer works, because the deal only works so long as the people, you know, get bread and circuses, as the Romans used to put it.
Thank you, Tom. A couple of questions, lots of questions here on the chat for Isabel, maybe, in around the extent to which COVID-19 significantly threatens the Chinese order, and whether we believe, and whether they believe, that their current system is actually sustainable in the medium term.
But someone wisely said that everything you say about China is both true and untrue. So with that, prefacing my remarks that way, what does COVID do? It obviously revealed, for a rather brief moment, the degree of unhappiness. It also revealed the weaknesses in the system. You know, the more authoritarian you become, the more you choke off the information flow that you need to have a well-functioning society, particularly one as complicated as China. So, you know, there are grave disadvantages to top-down authoritarianism. We've seen that, you know, throughout the history of the People's Republic in particular. You know, things like the Great Leap Forward and the mass starvation, you know, largely came from top-down authoritarianism, mistaken policies that couldn't be corrected. So I think that the system, and I disagree with Charlie's thought that the system will collapse. And I think it's helpful to look at Japan in the 1990s, which had followed a very, very similar path to the path that China has followed, and got to the same, very similar point, I should say, in terms of the accumulation of problems of that economic model. And Japan didn't collapse, but it did stagnate. And my sense of what will happen in China is that you will have a long, slow period in which China is trying to manage disappointed expectations and deal with problems, and won't be growing as it had in the past. And that's a new political challenge. I don't think that leads to, you know, rebellion from the streets. I think there are lots of mini rebellions in the streets, but if China's system is to change, I think it's probably still true that all politics in China are essentially elite politics, and that if there is a challenge to the current configuration, it will come from within the party. And that's not at all impossible. You know, that has happened again repeatedly, that all politics in China essentially happen inside the party. And that could take China in a different direction. It's very difficult to predict. I think as far as what we should be worried about goes, I mean, I think collapse is not in anybody's interest, frankly. It could be very, very nasty if it were to happen. But we would be interested in a course correction. And I think in the meantime, we need to be concerned about the degree to which China is trying to become a global normative power. You know, we've talked about the rules-based order. Our rules-based order is in some trouble because the main country that is meant to uphold it has gone AWOL right now, or gone rogue. So, you know, we talk about WTO rules. The WTO currently has no functioning arbitration system because the United States won't appoint judges. And, you know, we talk as though the world hasn't changed. The world has changed on both sides. So you know, what we are defending is under pressure from two superpowers that are both behaving badly, frankly, right now. So the degree to which China can take advantage of this, and has been working quite hard to become a normative power, in which in multilateral institutions and in global institutions, human rights are just read very differently or not read at all, in which China sets rules for all manner of things, from technologies through to the functioning of the internet or global health. You know, these are things that we need to be very, very tuned to, and we need to be very clear about what we're defending, because I think we've been a little woolly about that, and we need to be robust in its defense. On the positive side, it is absolutely the case that we need to cooperate with China on climate change, which is coming down the track, and that, you know, we really can't fix this without China. China is not hostile at all to the proposition that we need to fix the climate. It sees the opportunity part of it in becoming the supplier of low carbon goods and services to a carbon constrained world. And you know, there are many, many areas of potential cooperation between the EU and China, but also, you know, between the City of London. If the City of London worked with China to make China's investments Paris compliant, that would be transformative, and that is possible, and that is a constructive part of the relationship. So I think we can't lose sight of the mutual interest, and we need to work on those whilst being very clear about where our own red lines are.
Super. Thank you very much. For anybody listening and participating, there's been a request for any background reading materials while everybody's in lockdown around China. So if you have any suggestions, please do put them on the chat. You've obviously fed people's hunger to learn more about China, which is great. So please do put them down. William, we've talked about mutual respect and a robust relationship with China. To what extent has Britain's reaction, behavior, attitude, policy, whatever you like to call it, in the last few years towards Hong Kong undermined any credibility that we can take any kind of robust position on anything?
Well, we're stuck on Hong Kong. We have responsibilities. We have no power. All we can do is to keep the issue there, to provide what sort of moral support we can to them, to point out to the Chinese that they need Hong Kong, that Hong Kong provides all sorts of useful services for China, and that if the Chinese regime were to destroy the degree of autonomy that still remains in Hong Kong, the Chinese economy would also suffer further. That's about as much as we can do. We should not kid ourselves in any way that there is much we can do either on Hong Kong or on any other aspect of our relations with China unless we work with others. And that's where we should be putting those efforts in. And that does mean our friends around the Pacific Rim, other countries in Europe that are engaged in this, and there are a few, not many, the Canadians, and the next American administration, which may possibly be a little less erratic than this one.
Yes, I'm just conscious of the time. We've got another 5 minutes. Let me see if I can pick one final question, maybe to put to Tom. We've had and I know you are not always aligned with current government policy. But a number of countries, and as Stephen has pointed out, in his view, we should be taking a more cautious approach towards foreign takeovers. Do you think there is any chance at all that this government will do that? Or is it far too laissez-faire, free market, ideologically oriented?
No, I think there's a definite possibility that we've just been conducting a hearing into imagination technologies recently, which is an example of an incremental takeover. It's one that began in 2017 and is now beginning to be completed, as it's likely in some way to be moved to Beijing. Again, this is an innovative company that has come up with new and interesting ways of breaking encryption and hiding backdoors, amongst other things. And they are, but they also do graphics accelerators and various other things. And what they what's happened to them is they've been slowly taken over, firstly by a US front company, entirely created for the purpose, and now they're being, it looks like they're being moved somehow or other to Beijing. All that is denied, by the way, by the company, but it appears extremely likely that that is the case. The government is talking about, and has in some ways been talking about, various laws on this, and I've spoken to the business secretary about it. The challenge for the UK is, if we are going to have any form of protection mechanism within our own domestic law, we need to get it in before we do any trade deals. Otherwise, you reopen trade deals. And this is something that is therefore under huge pressure to act on quickly, as we're beginning to talk about trade deals with any number of different countries, including, of course, with the European Union. And so this is really where we need to go quickly. Now, I thought that Lord Wallace was absolutely right on Hong Kong as well, because just as we need to be clear that protecting our interests is about protecting the sovereignty, as it were, of our intellectual property, whether that's services or tech businesses, we need to be careful that the undermining of the rule of law in Hong Kong does not leave our judges, who sit in the Court of Final Appeal as non-resident, non-permanent judges, are not simply the whitened sarcophagus to an empty tomb. And there's a real danger here for the UK's reputational risk. There's also a danger if we pull out, that it undermines the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are various different challenges to all of us, and it's one where actually Britain and China both still have an interest in Hong Kong stability.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time, and I'm going to hand over to Ben for some final announcements. I'd like to thank everybody. It was for me, fascinating learning experience. Thanks to all the panelists for their wonderful contributions. Thanks to all of you who have joined this discussion, either on Zoom or on Facebook. Without doubt, we've left some people disappointed that we didn't go into greater detail on the practicalities of how one moves forward in one way or another. But I think that's something that is unlikely for anybody to be able to cover in an hour and a half. So maybe something for follow-up activities. Thank you again. And on that, I'd like to hand over to Ben for some ideas about that.
So firstly, thank you to our excellent panel. That was fantastic, both inspiring and depressing. Inspiring because I now feel I know much more than I did at the beginning of this process, and depressing because I've only begun to vaguely scratch the surface. To make certain that we take this process forward, this has been quite comfortably our largest webinar, and there's clearly a lot of interest in this subject. Initially, Charlie came to me with a suggestion that we write a paper on future relations with China, and it felt too early. It still feels slightly too early, but what I'm going to ask both the panel to do is to write up their thoughts at the end of this, and we'll try and put those into a pamphlet with a series of different viewpoints. And I'd also throw that open to anyone who is part of this discussion who would like to contribute a short essay. Feel free to email me after this, which you can do via the Radix site, if you'd like to, as I say, contribute to a pamphlet, which we'll try and put together over the next month or so. That's progress on China. Second thing I wanted to say is this is the fourth of our series of webinars that we've been having since the lockdown, and we will be doing one early next month, which will look at the impact of COVID on the plans of the government for infrastructure and what's both still possible and what's still practical and what's still sensible. So that's coming up, and you'll get an email about that, and hopefully it will be of interest. Lastly, just a reminder that Radix is a charity. We don't charge for any of our events, but if you would like to make a contribution, if you support the work we're doing, please feel free to look at your reminder email that you received from us before this evening, and you can follow through the link there and make a small or indeed a large contribution if you wish. Thank you very much to Joe, brilliantly chaired. Thank you to all of our speakers, and hope you've had a very good evening. Good night.
Thank you. Bye. Good night. Good evening.